Welcome to SQL Handbook. My name is Shashin, and in this video, we're going to go through what are recursive CTEs in SQL. Let's get into it. So let's just start with what are recursive CTEs in SQL. So a recursive CTE is just a regular CTE, but it has the ability to reference itself within the inner query of the CTE. So when I say inner query, you know that a CTE is structured with CTE name, and then there's an inner query, which is written over here typically. In the parentheses after you write as, right? There's an inner query over here. And then we have an outer query that references the CTE name, right? But in a recursive CTE, the inner query references itself. So the inner query can reference the CTE name as well, which is typically only found in outer query behavior. But in recursive CTE, it's different. The inner query can also do that too. And that's what makes it recursive, because the inner query is going to keep referring to itself until a result set is given that's empty. Until that condition is met, the recursive CTE will just keep going and keep getting iterations of result sets. I know that might sound confusing, but I'll have an example later that I'll show you guys, which will make more sense. Okay, so now in the inner query, you can see that the structure is now changed when we talk about recursive CTEs. This over here is the structure of how we do recursive CTEs. So it's the same as earlier. We have a with statement with a CTE name. We have an outer query that queries against the CTE, but the inner query is a bit different. The inner query has something called anchor member and a recursive member. These two are essentially two different queries, an anchor query and a recursive query. The anchor query is like the starting point for our recursion to occur. This is just a regular query that you would find in any inner query for any CTE. There's not much difference in there. It's just the starting point, and it only runs one time. Now, what makes this recursive is this recursive member over here. This recursive query is going to reference the CTE name in the query itself, right? And this recursive query will keep running and keep doing iterations till it returns an empty result set, right? And it will start, the first result set will be whatever the anchor query spits out, okay? Then from there, the recursive query is going to reference the anchor query, the result set from the anchor query, and keep doing iterations till it can't do any more, and it returns an empty result set. Okay, let's see how that happens in an actual example. So over here, I have a table that I've made called employees. If I show you guys that table, you'll see that I got a couple of columns over here: employee ID, name, department, salary, hire date, and manager ID. Now, before I go into the data, I just want to say that recursive CTEs are very useful in us finding out the hierarchy of data, right? It's very useful for that, and that's what we're going to do over here. So you can see each row over here is a different employee, right? We got 7 employees. And what I want us to do is that we have a task over here. We got to find the big boss of Alice. So there is an employee called Alice, employee ID 1, and we got to find who's her boss and then who's that boss's boss. So the manager and then the manager's manager, right? To do this, recursive CTEs are very useful. Now, I understand this table is very small, and you can probably look at the table and figure out who's Alice's manager and then who's the manager's manager, right? But imagine if the table had millions of records. This would be quite tricky. You don't want to be going through these records one by one. It's not very practical. That's why recursive CTEs are very useful. So how do we do this? Essentially, I want to write a query that will look at Alice's record, right? This one record over here, and it will take the manager ID of Alice. So Alice's manager ID is 3, and that manager ID correlates to an employee ID for another employee, right? So that's how the data is structured. So for example, Alice with manager ID of 3, but then we find the employee ID that has a 3, which is Charlie over here. So we can assume Alice's direct manager is Charlie, right? And then so on and so on. So that's how the employee ID and the manager ID relate to each other in this table for this example. Okay, so that's our task, to find the big boss of Alice, right? So how do we do that? Now over here, I've written out a query. It's a recursive CTE. So I start off with the with clause, and then I give it a CTE name, in this case, management chain. And then I write as, and I open up brackets, right, over here. And now in the brackets is our inner query. But this is a CTE, so we know that there's 2 parts to the inner query: an anchor query, which is this, and a recursive query, which is the bottom part over here. and they're combined with a union all statement, right? That's important. So that's the general structure for recursive CTE. Now let's look at how it's actually working, like how the inner workings of it work, so you guys can get a better idea of how and when to use a CTE, a recursive CTE. So this anchor query is the starting point. I've put a comment over here. We're starting from the employee Alice, right? Because that's what we're trying to solve for right now, right? We're trying to find Alice's manager and then that manager's manager. That's the current task. So I've given us an anchor query where it just says select employee ID, the name, manager ID, and level. Level is a derived column that I've just made up. I've given a hard-coded value of 0 to it from the employees table, the table that we just saw, where our name equals Alice, right? So if I were to run this, I just get one row back. And as I said, employee ID, name, manager ID, and level, right? Now with this one row, this is our starting point for our recursive CTE. This is our anchor query. Remember that. So now we know what our anchor query result set is. What happens next is we have this recursive query that's going to fire based on what the result set was on the anchor query. Okay, so the recursive query just starts with select employee ID, the name, manager ID, level +1, okay, from employees table. Okay, that's cool. Inner join to the management chain CTE. You can see over here, we've actually gone ahead and referenced the CTE name within the inner query of the CTE, right? This is still the inner query, and the CTE name is used over here for the inner join, right? That's what makes this unique to a normal CTE. In a normal CTE, you won't get this kind of behavior. In a recursive CTE, you would, right? So now inner join to management chain, and we give an alias called MC on employee ID from the employees table, matching the manager ID from the management chain, from this management chain CTE. Now, this inner join to the CTE itself is just referring to the previous result set that was run from this whole inner query, right? Now, what do I mean by that? So we know that the first result set is the anchor query, right? Which is this over here. So we get this result set, employee ID 1, name Alice, manager ID 3, level 0, right? Let me get the whole table so you guys can see this. So this recursive CTE just ran on the anchor query. The anchor query is just returning this first row. That's all it's returning. So that's the input for this management chain for this join right now, okay? So we take that first row as the inner join, and we're saying where employee ID from the employees table, which is this whole table, equals to the management chain MC manager ID, which is just that one row, right? So what's the manager ID for that one row? It's 3. So 3 goes over here, okay? And then the employee ID, we have to match to the employees table, which is this whole table, where employee ID is 3. So which row would that be? That would be this row over here. Because this row over here, sorry, you can't see me clicking there, hold on. There we go. This row over here is where employee ID is 3, and that's what's meant to equal the manager ID 3 of the previous result set, which is Alice. So now we're getting a result set of Charlie, this one row here, which is employee ID 3, name Charlie, right? So now you can imagine we have this temporary table, think of it as that, where we have Alice, which was given to us from the anchor query, right? And then we did an iteration on it using the recursive CTE. And now we got a new row added to that temporary table called Charlie. So that temporary table only has Alice and Charlie for now. Something else to keep in mind is we have this derived column called level, which has +1 to it every time we do an iteration. So what has happened here is Alice, the anchor query, we know its level is 0 because we hard-coded that, right? Now we do iteration on it and we do +1. So we got Charlie on the iteration, and now we know for Charlie's level column, it won't be 0, it'll be +1, which is just 1, right? So now we got the temporary table there, just for the moment. Since we got a result set returned, which is Charlie, we're going to do it again. So now the recursive CTE is going to run on just Charlie. So we again take the whole employees table, because that's what we wrote in the query. So this whole table is inner joined to the previous result set of management chain, which is just Charlie, which is just this row. So this whole table is now joined to this row over here where we just have Charlie on again the same condition. So the management chain manager ID for Charlie is 6, right? So we put 6 over here, and then the employee ID, we have to look now where employee ID matches 6 in the employees table, right? So where does it equal 6? Right over here. So that's Grace. So now we know Charlie's manager is Grace. Okay. So now that temporary table that I mentioned for us to imagine has Alice, has Charlie, and now it has Grace added to it. And keep in mind, the level is +1 again. This is another iteration. So on the previous result set, which was Charlie, which had a level of 1. So now it's going to be level 2 for Grace, right? So now Grace is added on to this temporary table. Now, since it returned a result set, we're going to do it again. But this time, you'll notice that when we do inner join to the management chain, which is just Grace, right, with the previous result set, which is now just Grace, we're going to find out for the management ID, it's just null. So we put null over here. What employee ID in the employees table equals to null? Nothing. So in that case, we're going to get nothing returned back to us. We're going to get an empty result returned back to us. When we get an empty result returned back to us, this ends the recursion. So now the CTE is completed. The recursive part of the CTE is completed. And so, as we know, we got Alice, Charlie, and Grace before the CTE, ran out of result sets to return to us. Then if we query the CTE in the outer query, so this is the whole CTE right here, right? The whole thing. Management chain, we say select star from management chain, order by level. What do we get? As suspected, we get the 3 rows that we just talked about. Employee ID 1 for Alice, employee ID 3 for Charlie, employee ID 6 for Grace. And you can see that the manager IDs are correctly connecting to those employee IDs. And the level, as we talked about, started at 0 because this is the anchor result set. Remember, the anchor query returned just this. And then each iteration pluses 1 to the level, right? So this was this was the first iteration because this is the anchor query, then this is the first iteration, and then this was the second iteration. And after the second iteration, nothing else is returned, so it's empty result set, so the recursion stops and it's finished, right? So that's how recursive CTEs work, like the step-by-step process of how they actually, the logic of it. So I hope that helps you guys. I'm going to put these notes into my SQL newsletter. You can get a link to my newsletter and you can subscribe to it. There'll be a link to it in my bio and also to my Instagram page, so you guys can follow for my clips and for my other content related to SQL. In my next video, I'm going to show you guys how in situations where, let's say, now I said to you, if the recursive CTE keeps returning a result set, it'll keep going. So what would happen if it never stops? We get an infinity amount of result sets returned to us. Does it just keep on going forever? I'll answer that question in my next video. So I hope this helped you guys understanding recursive CTEs a bit more. Subscribe to the channel below, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.